So welcome everybody to the April session, the third session of the Dance the Music of Time reading group. This month, we're going to be looking at volume 3 of the series, The Acceptance World. In terms of where we are in timeline, we're now into the 1930s. So there are references. It's probably a period of about 24 months in total covered by this. Now, essentially the trio of Nick, Peter Templer, and Charles Stringham, who were schoolmates in the first volume, are now out in the world. It's 10 years later. And so we have a lot more. Essentially, they've fully emerged into the grown-up world, essentially, of life. And just a couple of comments. I think at this point we start to really see in Powell how much the nuances of English social life, and particularly how it was changing during this period with factors like the political and economic changes from the Great Depression, which affected England as well, of course. I like this quote from D.J. Taylor in his collection After the War, where he talks about the fact that it can give the impression of being written in a subtle and sophisticated code whose solution presupposes a highly developed social as opposed to literary sensibility on the part of the reader. And I think to some extent that may illuminate one of the reasons why Powell is not heartily embraced in the academic community, is that he's perceived as sort of more a social novelist than a literary figure to that extent, not as embedded in that. But let's open it up for questions and comments about the reading. Any first reactions or ideas that folks? So we have Frank, if you want to go off mute.
So I think this is the first book where we see most of the major characters in play. And every time somebody returns, I sort of punch the air. I'm so happy. You think this book is gonna pass without Widmerpool come in, and then at the end, he really steals the book with that last scene. And you see Stringham, you see Templar, and it visiting it for the third time, it really is an absolute joy, this one.
Absolutely. Other reactions and thoughts? Raymond?
Yeah, I didn't say anything at the last session, but I'm one of the people, maybe a minority, who don't like a buyer's market. I find the first section with the three parties frustrating, irritating, and difficult to read, difficult to like, and the sort of the song lyrics, hate the song lyrics. So when I arrived in this book, it's with a kind of great sense of relief that everything kind of slows down. We have good long set pieces, and Nick, we wouldn't call him, he's still quite a passive character, but he's more active in this novel than much more active than in the preceding novel. And a final thing I wanted to say is that when I first read the books, I set out to read the 12 books, 30 odd years ago, and I borrowed them from the public library. And I couldn't find the first book, so I started with The Buyer's Market, and which was a terrible mistake. And because that's, if anything, the most difficult book to penetrate. So it's a bit of a miracle, I think, that I actually did stay the course, go back to book one, and then everything was rosy after that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Powell was adamant on the fact that the books stand on their own, but it really is hard to see that anyone would not feel somewhat dissatisfied if you read it in isolation and not in the context of all the relationships and the histories that are intertwined and interwoven throughout the series. Susan, I'm just taking in the order I'm seeing them on screen. Susan Maxwell, if you could go off mute.
Hi, sorry, I was just unmuting.
Right.
Sort of, this kind of came to my mind after John's talk about Mrs. Eardley and so on. And she's actually a very interesting character because there's nothing in the rest of the novels that really hint at anything other than a purely realist dimension. But Mrs. Eardley is presented, and almost increasingly so as she appears to the novels, as it's like a kind of Schrodinger's cat. At the same time, one and the same time, she's faintly ridiculous, but she also does seem to have these genuine spiritual powers and insights. And these are just, and in fact, even within the book, the acceptance world, some of her predictions are borne out. And this is kind of in contrast, say, to Scorpio Murdoch in the later books, where he's just presented as an out and out charlatan. So I thought that was kind of interesting. She's sort of in this indeterminate position. I don't know. I suppose possibly a nearest comparison would be someone like Madame Blavatsky, who oscillates between, yeah, she's just a kind of a fraud and whatever, but just somebody of a very kind of compelling um, personality, and that you can never be quite sure there's nothing to it.
Well, certainly, I think she's one of the examples of a character who, let's say, in the hands of maybe somebody like a Wodehouse or a Waugh, would be simply ridiculous. And I think one of the things that you can't help but like about and really admire in Pohl is that he doesn't dismiss people. You know, he is willing, Nicholas Jenkins, at least through the voice of Nicholas Jenkins, Pohl is much more open to taking characters at face value and not sort of labeling them and setting them aside as, you know, marginal or oddballs or freaks or weird or whatever you want to call. So we got lots of folks up. Chris Burns, if you'd like to go off mute.
Thank you. I've seen, like, in this particular book, Acceptance World, we've got, I think the characters are experiencing something that a lot of us go through at this time in that period of their lives. You've got a group of people, say, from school that are working their way out of school. Some of them still have one foot in academia and another foot, you know, in the world of business. And others, you know, run headfirst into the city, as he refers to it, and, you know, become immediately successful. So then you've got the situation where, in Nick's case, some of his friends have kind of like moved onward and upward, and some of them are still kind of like trying to find their way. I think Nick is still trying to find his way at this age. You know, you wind up with like a low-level job in a field that you want to be in, but it's not particularly satisfying. It doesn't pay very well, but, you know, you have to stick with it. And meanwhile, you've got some other friends that, like I say, go, you know, right into business, and you know, they're kind of successful, or more successful than you are at the moment. And so it's kind of hard to balance all that, especially at that age. So, you know, Acceptance World is, you know, it's all a part of growing up, and I think Pohl like describes it perfectly. And I don't think that it's dated at all. I think people are going through this today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that those early years of adulthood, or my daughter calls it adulting. You know, that there's a lot of sifting out, and a lot of it is and you can see this particularly with Whitmerpool more than anyone, which is just figuring out the game of success and starting to, you know, manipulate it to your advantage, while others like Nick are essentially sort of, you know, dog paddling along and just keeping their head above the water and hoping that, you know, something drives them for a direction in their career. Let me go with just from left to right, Richard.
Yeah, there are a number of things that I very much enjoyed in this book, particularly this bizarre conflict between uh, uh, Quiggin and members, how Quiggin just kind of insinuates himself into St. John Clarke's world, and this battle over this author who just isn't really all that important, and how it's like it's like one of those situations where the battle is so fierce because the stakes are so small. And it culminates in this hilarious sequence where uh, they're pushing poor St. John Clarke through the park in this political march, and it's not 100%. I mean, he's gone completely Trotskyist because he's just, I guess, old, and it's like, and Nick's just kind of watching it happen, and like, yeah, well, this is happening too, and how and then Members is on the outs, and then he's back, and it's really funny. I mean, it struck me as very funny, not necessarily in a laugh out loud kind of way, but as just kind of shining a light on these guys in opposition to the other people he knows, who seems to be much more cool about their success, in part because they're probably making a lot more money. And of course, poor Labat at the end, uh, having his incident at the
Right.
uh,
Right.
but and the other and then of course DuPont, whom we meet in the first book in that awful car incident, seems to be not only losing his wife, but also crashing and burning, because they had to sell the house where the party was in the second book, and you know, it's pretty clear that and, you know, the poor little kid who seems to be caught with a mother who doesn't seem to be terribly well. I don't know. I might have misread it, but anyway, she seems more concerned with her life than with this poor kid. Meanwhile, you know, DuPont's crashing, and then Jean is starting instigate, and Nick instigate this affair. Uh, Culminating in that weird, again, a really weird restaurant scene. There's just so many odd things going on, and Nick just kind of reports them. And I think that's part of my enjoyment of it. It's like sometimes it sounds like a Monty Python sketch played straight, which I guess was the point of my Monty Python, because they were spoofing this kind of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
Anyway, but that conflict
Yeah.
is just a scream, because, you know, what is it over? It's over this author. Not only does like nobody read him, but Nick is just waiting and waiting and waiting for this introduction, which is never coming. And
Yeah.
that kind of forms in addition to the prophecy at the beginning, it just kind of forms the overall arch of the novel. And you're like, no, this isn't coming. I mean, but he can't like let go of it because they've already invested so much uh, capital in it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, it's funny, you know, St. John Clarke, as the Brits would call him, St. John Clarke. Um, Usually I see references identifying or associating him with John Galsworthy, but to me, it's Hugh Walpole is who he's yeah, Hugh Walpole, who, if you're into ghost stories, you probably may be familiar with his name, but he was a writer who was already well past his time in the 30s, but kept producing. He was a dauntless, and he was also closeted homosexual, which is why I think it's part of the St. John Clarke, and what I mean, there. In fact, one of the very most British biographies ever written is by the publisher Rupert Hart Davis about Hugh Walpole, where he writes an entire biography where there is absolutely no mention in any, not even in inferences, that Walpole was homosexual, because Hart Davis was a proper above guy who would have thought that was, you know, mucking around with things. But yeah, I mean, Hugh Walpole, if you know where he stood in the literary world in 1930, you can't imagine anybody having, you know, fisticuffs over who gets to be his secretary. he was an irrelevancy by then. Let's go with Paul Milken next.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I think for me in the acceptance world, there's a change in the emotional temperature of the novel sequence, particularly in the section where Nick takes Jean in his arms in the car as they're traveling to Templar's house, and they see the bathing beauty eternally diving off her board into the pool. Up to then, I mean, Nick, as we know, has been a pretty dispassionate observer of events and narrator of events. But from that point onwards, he is more emotionally engaged, I think, as an individual. And interestingly, when I was talking to Hilary Sperling, she said that The Acceptance World was Violet Poll's favorite novel in the sequence.
Yeah, she mentions that actually in Sperling's biography. And Violet Poll's essentially says that in one of her books, one of her own memoirs.
And I think and Hilary said it was basically because the whole kind of erotic nature of that passage and the succeeding passages was the one that reminded her most strongly of how their relationship started. One would think it would be when Nick meets Isabel Tolland, but because that more clearly in real life matches the sort of meeting between the two of them in Ireland. But for her, it was that passage which most accurately described it. By the way, Richard's comment about the wheelchair, St. John Clark in the wheelchair, reminds me. Anthony Powell was very struck by seeing T.S. Eliot pushing a literary acquaintance in a wheelchair around London very often. And of course, Powell and Eliot knew each other because they both holidayed in the North Devon resort of Lee. And somewhere, I can't remember where, Powell says that kind of image, somebody pushing a wheelchair, stuck with him. And I think that partly inspired that image in Dance, although the characters, of course, in the wheelchair and those pushing it are very different. But of course, in The Fisher King, he also has a character in a wheelchair in the last novel that he wrote. So just an amusing little sideline. Powell and T.S. Eliot, actually, that's a subject for another discussion, perhaps. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Paul. Guy, next.
Yes, the observation I've got about The Acceptance World is that it seems to be the first novel in the sequence so far that has a great sense of the period of the time and social matters, literary and political. Like Question of Upbringing is, a lot of it is very much a school story, if you like, adolescence. And then the second one is so based around the three parties. And it's only with The Acceptance World, this is my view, is that we are living in the late 20s, early 30s, all that's going on around there. This is the first in the sequence that I've actually noticed this.
Right. I mean, certainly the reference to the means test, the marchers, that was a big. I mean, there were a series of essentially national level marches going on during the political and economic turmoil between the late 20s and the early 30s. Leslie? We need you off of mute, though.
Yeah, am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I was wondering who St. John Clark was too. How do you map him to the literary figures of the time? He's not Somerset Maugham, he's not Goldsworthy, he's not Arnold Bennett. I think Walpole is a reasonable choice. I still have a few thoughts, but I was thinking about this. Well, I mean, the sequence so far, and perhaps this volume in particular, of Nick Jenkins kind of wandering around, bumping into people, hearing bits and pieces of things that are going on, and saying, I don't know what's going on. I can't make any sense of this. There is no story here. You know, he doesn't actually see it as, you know, a narrative. He's kind of seeing it as bits and pieces. And I found this quite interesting because a few years ago I was reading several other novels by other novelists of about the same period, and they had a narrator who was in a very similar position of kind of bumping into people and getting bits of the story, but they were, you know, kind of turning it into a narrative, and they were very kind of conveniently meeting people who had the next bit of the story, you know, like a kind of not exactly a detective, but, you know, picking up the next strand of next clue and the next strand. But he's not doing that. He's just kind of wandering along and saying, you know, this is just all happening, which is kind of interesting and you know, realistic, and you know, he's not, in a way, he's not part of any story. He's just kind of wandering around, observing, not even observing really. He's not, you don't feel the sense that he's standing there in the corner kind of, you know, being a you know, a person who's picking up on everything. He's just kind of letting these things happen to him.
Well, it's interesting to think. I mean, and I think this is kind of a major question throughout the book is Nick as an observer? Because one thing that struck me is striking me in a reread this time around is that he is absolutely not the Henry James,
No, exactly. He's not
you know,
that
one
kind of.
on whom nothing is lost.
He's
And
not
in
doing
fact,
that
I have a little,
exquisite perception thing.
yeah, I put a little chart together that shows Nicholas essentially circling around on the margins of the arts world, the economic world, the business world, the political world, the social world. And you know, one of the things that I mean, and it's him to some extent. I mean, like, and you see it in this book where his understanding of the acceptance world, which was this kind of merchant banking system that kind of rose in the 20s and 30s, and I think it's pretty much died out now, of essentially accepting risk for and pay in the international payment systems. But you know, these terms get thrown out about base metals and this, that, and the other thing, and you know, it's sort of like it's some business crud. It's something to do with business. I don't know. And so he knows, you know, he knows a little bit about a lot of stuff, but like many people, particularly if you work in a large organization, you know, you have the bits that you deal with frequently, and you sort of build a definite view of it, but then it kind of becomes a mystery that goes off into the cloud. And Nick seems like a guy who's often passing on the fringe of clouds.
Yeah, and he knows these words and he knows the vocabulary, but you know, he can kind of sound as though he knows what he's talking about.
Right,
And he can
right.
go, but yeah.
But he's not, you know, for me, what I find is I'm the type of person, if I see bits, I will begin to try to make sense of them and defend them. What's behind that? And for Nick, it's like, I saw that, you know, there's a bunch of details behind it. None of it mattered to me. Nick Burns and Susan.
Hi, I just wanted to say a couple of things. The acceptance world, certainly for me, when I first read the books, was where it took off for me. And it's interesting because I was 14 when I first read it. And yet it was when the characters entered adulthood that it really began to zip along. And I began to really read in the groove of the book. And so I would echo what other people are saying, is that this is really where the main sequence begins. With St. John Clark, the two secretaries thing is from Logan Pearsall Smith, who was actually an American-born man of letters, resident in London at the time, as two of Pole's friends succeeded each other as secretary. I do think there are aspects of Walpole, especially when Nick Jenkins actually meets St. John Clarke in the fifth book in Casanova, and what they talk about. Hugh Walpole actually did review something of or mention something of AP's in an American newspaper, and that was in the book. But I do think Galsworthy is a big part of St. John Clarke's character, particularly St. John Clarke's late turn to the left, which was also true of Galsworthy. Galsworthy was always lauded in the Soviet Union because he was perceived as making that late turn to the left and writing about a critique of English society. Also, Walpole just wrote so much. Walpole was really as close as you could get to being a hack writer as you could be and still be all literary. He wrote many, many novels. Whereas I think St. John Clarke, only 6 or 7 books of his are ever named, and the rate of production is more of that of Galsworthy. So I think it's an amalgam of a kind of Edwardian man of letters living beyond his time, but there are aspects of different people that contribute to him. And it's very interesting the way, although we do meet him in person eventually, we largely know of St. John Clarke through other people's reactions to him and to his fiction, and which one is their favorite. And he remains, long after his death, his reputation is there in the 12th book. And it's one of the most fascinating things about the sequence is the way he's largely known through his work, even though his work is not very good, but he's still largely known through his work.
Well, like Galsworthy, a lot of folks, who don't want to get into, say, heavy lifting literary reading enjoyed Galsworthy. He stayed. In fact, it's not to diverge too long, but there's an argument that there's a difference between a classic and a book that's in the canon. And the difference is many classics, and one could argue that The Dance is a classic, that the classics are the ones that essentially sustain a readership regardless of their critical reputation. And the academic who has put this argument forward holds Khalil Gibran's The Prophet up as a classic example of a book that no academic takes of any critical merit, and yet stays in print decade after decade after decade, and people still read it. And St. John Clarke gives a flavor of being that kind of a writer that people, he'll keep on getting reprinted and people will still read him, even though nobody has any setting, it takes them seriously from a critical standpoint. Susan?
I just wanted to mention something that had struck me while I was reading the book, but that has kind of been given a more solid context from some things that some of the other speakers said. One being Paul's comment about Nick being more emotionally present in this book than in the earlier ones, and also Leslie's point about the kind of sense that he doesn't really know what's going on. He's kind of just witnessing things that he can't necessarily make a narrative from. And what had struck me was that in the earlier books, particularly the first one, there's a lot of kind of movement in time in the way that Nick describes things. Describing what's happened in the past, but when he introduces a character, he immediately kind of moves to the future and says what happens to them. How they interacted later, or what career the person took up. That's not a good example, but I can't remember exactly offhand. So there's a lot of almost predicting what will happen in the future based on the person he has just introduced. And that kind of goes in the acceptance world. He's always very present, and he doesn't do this kind of moving around in the past and the future as much. And the other thing that struck me was that he makes the narrator is sort of very perceptive about what's going on, perceptive about people. But in this book, he makes quite a number of generalizations about women that are quite sweeping. And it jarred a little bit, but
when Leslie was saying about him not really knowing what's going on, these things happened after he started the affair with Jean, and it's almost as though he doesn't really have any more of his own definite assertions. So he falls back on these kind of cliches and these kinds of sort of generalized ideas. So he's not as specific, he's not as individual in the way he speaks of her when he started the affair, as though it is so new an activity for him, or so new an experience for him, that he doesn't really know how to put his own mark on how he describes it.
Yeah, that could well be. One thing that struck me in the and there are not too many actually recorded dialogues between Nick and Jean, but I was really struck just as you see them on the page. They're the only telegraphic conversations that you see in the whole series, which is most of the conversations are relatively long-winded, I would say. Whereas with Nick and Jean, it's like these, where are we going to meet? Down the hall. What time? Can we meet Wednesday? No, not Wednesday. How about Thursday? No, not Thursday. It's just so striking that Jean is so terse compared to so many other characters so far, at least in the book, and even later on. Most of them tend to be a little more loquacious than she is. That was striking. I wanted to offer something that because this is an observation I hadn't really seen anybody else make and focus on. So this is from Kingsley Amos's review in The Spectator from 1955. Kingsley Amos was one of the angry young men novelists. He was just rising at the time, but he was a big fan of Powell, and he got to know Powell personally later on. And he says, and I'm just going to, it's a couple of sentences here. The theme of the human dance to continue is in any case not the only theme, sinking as it does at times more to the level of a leitmotif, if so intellectual a term may be forgiven. At least as important and, to some, more interesting is the generalization about power, or living by the will, which is gradually gathering shape in these pages. Power has always interested this author. Everyone in What's Becoming of Waring wanted power, at least according to the narrator. That frightful pair in Agents and Patients, Maltravers and Chip Chase, were pursuing it in their own way. Even the farcical Zouch, the Ubermensch from A View to the Death, was after the stuff. In The Music of Time, the pattern is clearer still. Widmerpool, Quiggin, and Sillery are only the most obvious embodiments. For Members, Quiggin's rival, covets literary status chiefly for the influence it brings. Barnby, the womanizing painter, is interested in domination rather than sensuality. Uncle Giles, shackled and ineffectual as he is, remains the type of entire egoist, and so on. In an age where the will to power takes ever more unexpected forms, we need someone to teach us the lesson that it can and does coexist with grotesqueness and fatuity. And that is something that it's clear we see that in the case of Widmerpool, because he is he is a cunning animal when it comes to operating in spheres of power. But it's not something we necessarily see stressed significantly. And I think one of the reasons we start to see a shift in this book with the acceptance world is that power becomes much more of a factor in the dance, so to speak, of how people get to move forward or move back or sideways or to their demise, as happens in the Wartime trilogy. But any thoughts about is power something you kind of see, or is it still sort of an obscure aspect of this? So, Marlene?
I don't know how to put my hand up on screen, so I'm just putting my hand up. Is there a button somewhere for putting your hand up?
Yes, there is, and it always changes it with Zoom.
Anyway,
never mind. You're on.
I think Mrs. Erdley is a good character who has a power over many people that is very, uh, it comes up in a number of the novels, and she kind of rides above the waves and is able to not direct things, but give people indications of where they're going and kind of shift the emotional atmosphere in big ways. And I mean, this is thinking ahead a bit, but the way she handled Pamela Flitton was very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that Mrs. Erdley is very much a case of someone with a fair bit of power.
We're struck, I would say, when there are people who are able to assert themselves in the book, because there's so much tentativeness, it seems, and in the behavior of a lot of characters, and particularly, yeah, Nick is not, not at all a forceful character pretty much ever, other than, asserting himself in the relationship with Jean. Let's go with Jean Reed first, and then Paul again.
Thank you, Brad. Just occurs to me that your reading group friends, members who have not before read The Dance, and probably are not members of the Society, would be very interested in going into the Society website, because there are months, I'm sure, months and months of discussion, email discussion about the will. In great depth, and it's never ending. It's a constant subject and very, very important throughout The Dance. So thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome. I mean, credit goes to Amos for reading. Once I read that, I thought, oh yeah, of course, it's so clear that that's a theme. We see it develop in much, more detail or more breadth in later volumes, but we're getting a taste of it already here by seeing that, particularly Widmerpool as somebody who's very interested in positioning himself, is somebody who's starting to figure out power and how to use it, so to speak, and how to manipulate it. Paul Milliken?
Yeah, the Acceptance World, I think, has one of the key sequences in the whole novel, whole 12-volume novel, is at the end with Widmerpool putting Stringham to bed. Widmerpool at the beginning, of course, is the boy the most least likely to succeed, effectively. And I think Paul's genius is that he balances, those who live by the imagination and those who live by the will. Some move forward, some move back. It's a score draw at the end, probably. But Widmerpool's treatment of Stringham really, is the first time that Paul starts to do the rebalancing, I think, in the reader's mind. And Paul himself liked people with plenty of attack and had a sneaking regard for those people who could grab opportunities and push themselves forward. And I think part of his genius is that, you mentioned it earlier, Brad, that he's very even-handed with regard to people. Don't judge the book by its cover, I think is Paul's mantra. Even Bob Duport, who's presented as a Philistine businessman, I mean, towards the end becomes much more sympathetic when he's talking to Jenkins. So yeah, I think, I mean, for me, the two key bits of the Acceptance World, I think, which influence the whole sequence, the Jean sequence I mentioned before in the car, and this Widmerpool Stringham sequence after the Le Bar dinner.
Yeah. Sally, and then I want to go to a comment that Frank offered in the chat.
I've just got two things. I'd like to say what Susan said about predicting the future of his characters. That's really how the novel opens with Mrs. Erdley, is that she's foreshadowing a lot. She's literally predicting the future for Nick. And also that whole opening sequence about the Hotel Ufford is very literary. And he even talks about Conrad, and it's a very beautiful literary passage. I was really struck with it. where the hotel is like it's moored in this backwater, Bayswater, and it's also like a superannuated schooner that Conrad writes about. And also, it's purgatory. It's a purgatory, and the only resident in purgatory is Uncle Giles. So it's a fascinating way of opening that whole novel, and I really loved it. That's it.
I think that's true, and this is probably something that those of us who are not as familiar with London, and particularly that there are neighborhoods by simply naming them in London, it already comes with a set of criteria about the economic status, the social status, and Bayswater from other in other even other writers is sort of like that's a quick way to it's like in New York referring to the Bronx versus Brooklyn. You can kind of be authentic and gritty if you come from Brooklyn, but if you come from the Bronx, you're just middle class, lower middle class, uninteresting.
Or Queens.
Yeah, Queens even worse. Yeah, exactly. So let me
Hey, I'm from Queens.
Uh-oh. I'm turning my
Frank, let's see the comment about Whitmerpool's speech at Labar's dinner. Did you want to offer another thought about it? Because that's interesting. He really asserts himself when no one asked for him to speak.
I think the old boys' dinner is a chance for the older members of Labar's school, and also people who were there before him, strangely, and just come along for a bit of social, get the chance to meet people and to sort of show off. And Widmerpool takes the opportunity, although he's probably one of the most junior, at least successful, to stand up and lecture everybody. And that just shows he's not going to care what other people say or what other people think of him. He's going to take his opportunities and try his damnedest to succeed in life.
Yeah. I that speech to me, there are several points throughout the whole volume or the whole series where I feel like Pohl is taking some comic glee in trying to make Widmerpool's speaking, his formal speech, and often in conversation, Widmerpool gets more and more and more pretentious as time goes on, and just recreating that sort of syntax and creating that sense. And I know later on, I think Ex Trapnel actually parodies Widmerpool's writing at some point. Let me go with John and then Timothy, and I think Richard, oh no, yeah. Oh, there's a thumbs up. Okay. John, next.
Thanks. I was struck by Nick's lack of ego with regard to his career. He's published a novel. And although this becomes part of the plot in that he realizes that St. John Clarke has made a mention of it, which relates to the thing we heard about Walpole earlier. But Nick doesn't seem to talk to anybody about what the novel is. No one seems to ask Nick about his novel. This is quite an achievement for someone in their late 20s. I would have thought that obviously he works in publishing, and Widmerpool asks him about the book right at the end, but we have absolutely no indication of whether the book's any good, what Nick feels about the book, whether he feels sense of satisfaction. It seems to be his emotional development, which Paul referred to, is what's really preoccupying him in this book, and that the career is just something that kind of is maybe that's taken care of, but his emotional life is not taken care of. So that's what preoccupies him. I'd be interested to know. Sorry, and the other point about power is that Nick often seems to have no power at all, even to arrange a time.
Absolutely. I mean, he is in none of these circles. So in the publishing world, he's a minor figure. He's sent off to do jobs, to go get this settled about the introduction. In the military, his jobs for the most part are sort of secondary kind of functions. And so, yeah, he is never the one in power, nor does he very rarely asserts himself. Uh, as in, he wouldn't make much of an action figure, so to speak. Timothy.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the PowerPoint as well. I really enjoyed in this book how you get the contrast between some of the characters who become very influential figures in society later on are like in this book sort of aligning themselves with established or already powerful figures. So you have like members in Quiggin fighting to be St. John Clark's secretary, and Widmerpool aligning himself with Magnus Donnus and then joining the acceptance world. But then you have, for me, it was contrasted with people like Uncle Giles, who kind of are very unwilling, like reject being identified with any sort of established group or established figure, and they try to derive their power from. And I think he's also compared with Peter Templar as well, as being people who kind of reject identification with the social group and try and sort of derive their power more from their own individuality. So I thought that was kind of interesting because, yeah, you have there's something quite sort of passive about like deriving your power from being someone's secretary or sort of joining a very established area in the city. But those are the characters who are probably successful in the long term. So I just found that quite interesting reading this.
I just wanted to, because you just remind me of a statement I wanted to read out of Hilary Sperling's whole biography about the acceptance world. And she says, in the acceptance world, Powell sharpened and concentrated his focus. By the end, Jenkins has lost his tentative air, published his first book, and stepped forward, or more precisely, slightly to one side, to take on an increasingly authoritative role as the presenter of the dance. Do you think he lost his tentative air? I feel like that's remains one of the signature aspects of Jenkins' character through the entire series. A tentative, when he enters into us, the beginning of any conversation with him, he's always sort of, hesitant to make any guesses or assertions about things. Well, I thought I'd heard this. So he strikes me as he remains tentative, but I don't know if the people disagree with that. Do you think his character changes significantly in this book?
I think there's a lot going on in his life that he just doesn't report on. Like, I get the feeling he's had affairs before Gene. He's written this book. There's this kind of job he's doing, and he's only focusing on this one aspect when there are other things. And he's just focusing on in his narrative, talking about these people that he finds interesting.
Right.
So so I think part of that is that he's just not particularly forthcoming. This is not a Barbara Streisand memoir that goes to 1,000 pages or something. He's just focusing on these things, and he isn't that interested in enough in himself to tell us about all the other stuff that may he be doing. Instead, he's just focusing on this kind of crazy neighborhood he lives in and these crazy people he keeps interacting with. So that might be part of the tentativeness, is that he just doesn't. And part of his discretion in talking about his relationship with Jean, we're not talking about. I'll think of some clever author who writes a lot about sex later. But he's kind of standoffish from us as much as he is from all these other people. So that might be a part of the tentativeness.
Certainly later on, he and Jean are discreet enough that no one seems to to suss what's going on between the two of them when it is going on, or even after the fact, including her husband, Bob.
Even in the house where it's happening. I mean, but of course, everybody else in that house is just so self-involved that they
Yeah,
probably,
and that is the nature of a lot of characters in Poe, that the world is everything that revolves around them. Let's get the last round of comments before we wrap up. Chris, and then Jean.
Just to say that I don't think enough time has passed in the context of the book. We start in like 1931 and we end up in 1933. So I don't know, we're talking about 2 years. And is a character going to like have like a big change in 2 year period? And if it does, I don't think you're going to see it until maybe a little bit later on. So, I mean, if Nicholas is coming in as one person, I don't really think he leaves the book as anybody else. I think that comes a little later on in some of the other books.
Fair enough. Jean?
Yes, I think you'll find as we read along that there are situations, books to come with situations where Nick is the only person who could have brought that important situation about. Not such a passive person, I don't think at all.
Okay. Doris?
I think even though he's so understated, he does have some kind of ethics or morality that
Oh, yes, I agree with that.
you don't see. He's the one that when Barbara pours the sugar over Widmerpool's, immediately this is not for me. This is not something good. And his two friends, Templar and Stringham, they're dissolute even, and their reactions with women are always, not they're not lasting. And it seems as Widmerpool grows up, he gets more callous. So I think Nick is in a way, he has some kind of standard that the others don't.
Oh, absolutely. And if you've ever read Christopher Hitchens' essay about Poe, in fact, he talks about Poe as the gold standard, partly because of his respect for Poe's personal integrity as an artist and as an individual, and his sense of, standards of behavior. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that we see other characters do in the course of this book that we know that Nick absolutely would not consider doing, and not just because, it was, not of his class, but simply that's behavior that he doesn't, he's not craven in that way. And certainly we later on, we start to see moral conflicts that Widmerpool is more than willing to take on that become increasingly reprehensible, and particularly as we start to find more out, particularly in there are a number of situations where we sort of like find out what actually was going on quite a bit later in the book or in another book, and Nick has a chance to introduce that information so that we start to realize nuances or complexities about a situation that weren't there in the first kind of instance of it. Okay, well, we've passed the hour. I just want to remind everybody that we'll be getting together on the 5th of May. All the time slots are staying the same. We seem to have avoided, I apologize, I did use GMT when I shouldn't have in an earlier email, but the accurate times are on the website. And we'll be talking about At Lady Molly's, which I think it was one of Poe's favorites of the whole series. And as I said, you can keep following. We'll be posting the links to the recording on the homepage as they get available on YouTube. And if there's anything in particular you'd like to see that we focus on or try to discuss in future sessions, and if you have anybody you'd like to suggest as a special guest to come join the discussion, please let me know. Thank you, everybody. Happy
Thank you,
reading.
Time on my hands and you in my